All right. Just let me know when you guys are ready. Yeah. You have a clicker, like. Yeah. All right. So this is Sam Bismuth of CPI, and I welcome everybody to this World Anti-Imperialist Platform event. Yeah. We are here to stand against imperialism and stand for national development and cooperation. This is the most critical task of Americans, is to stand for these important values. So first, to the stage, I welcome Karen Niles of PCUSA. I should say this after I describe her, but she is a member of the PCUSA National Office. The PCUSA is one of the most recent signers of the WAP 21. And for those that don't know, the PCUSA is an American-based Marxist-Leninist party carrying the traditions of old-school, authentic communism. So welcome, Karen.
Well, first of all, it's great to see all the people that we communicate with, either through Zoom or from Telegram and all that. I think we have CPI, we have PCUSA. Who else do we have here right now? Anyone else? Who?
CPGBML.
CPGBML, right, forgot, thank you. And that's why we're here. We're a coalition. It was interesting, our own General Secretary, and I'll explain in a minute, when we had Irene from Rage Against the War Machine, when we had her as a speaker, our General Secretary says, wow, this is a coalition. And I think we need to keep on fostering that for the next 2 years, because nobody's going to take any world leaders' stance. They're not going to, none of them are going to solve the solutions. The only thing that's going to be is coalitions. And the more we support each other, and the one thing that we're always concerned about is that people become selective. And they say, well, I don't like this organization's point of view on this position. However, I am against imperialism. Well, when are we going to start getting rid of all those little issues? The only way we're going to win, and we can win, because nobody likes world leaders anymore. They're individuals. So, PCUSA, we love our heritage. The CPUSA was where many of our founding members came from. But they went the way of perestroika in 1991. And we tried to find a home, and a few of the people did. And it took a while. Let's see, that was 1991. I think our first Congress is a new party. This is a party of Communist USA. And it was no accident that we are the branch of CPUSA, and we call ourselves PCUSA, because we do honor the old heritage of the CPUSA. It was what happened in perestroika. So all of our heroes from CPUSA, we still honor today. So that's the important thing. And we all have diverse issues. And even in our own party, there are some people that don't like particular ones. But the party is first, unity is first. And I really hope that this is the beginning of something that's going to be really big in the next 2 years. And I'm sure everybody's going to tell you about all the things that are going to be happening in 2024. Yeah. Okay, any questions? All right, we have with people from PCUSA. Please raise their hands so I can see how many of us are here. Okay, there you go. Okay, just wanted to let you know that we are here. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Karen. That was really inspiring, and that's really, that's the path that we have to go down, is a path of unity rather than bickering amongst each other and fighting over trivial issues. So next up, we have Caleb Maupin, who is an internationally renowned journalist, writer, and an RT correspondent. He's the ideological leader of CPI, which is an American-based Marxist-Leninist think tank. welcome Caleb Maupin to the stage.
Hey everyone, glad you're here. So before I actually make my brief message and then we hear from our keynote speaker, Joti Brar, I've always felt, I guess, that you cannot have a meeting without music, right? It is just a necessity. You cannot have a communist meeting without music. So I'm going to pass this out. Everyone's got it here, right? So just pass it from person to person, right? And it's starting to be the holiday season. And there's a song that we all know, "Oh, Christmas tree, oh, Christmas tree." And ever since I've been a communist, every time I hear that song, I have to start thinking, "The people's flag is deepest red." So I thought we could all just sing the classic British communist anthem, The Red Flag, here today. So pass around the sheet, and as a group, we'll stand up and we'll sing The Red Flag to start out the meeting. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right, very good. So just make sure we get as many sheets out as possible. Share with somebody if you need one. I'll step away from the microphone so that I don't overpower everybody. And we'll sing The Red Flag. So let's get the sheets around.
You still need one.
And then it's to the tune of "Oh Christmas Tree," and it's "Oh Christmas Tree," and you've got the lyrics right in front of you. So, all right. Are we ready? The people's flag is deepest red. It shrouded off our martyr dead. And ere their limbs grew stiff and cold, our hearts blood-eyed its every fold. Then raised the scarlet standard high. Within its shade we live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. Look round, the Frenchman loves its blaze. The sturdy German chants its phrase. In Moscow's vaults its hymns are sung. Chicago swells the surging throng. Then raise the scarlet standard high. Within its shade we live or die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. It dwelled above our infant might, when all ahead seemed dark as night. It witnessed many a deed and vow. We must not change its color now. Then raise the scarlet standard high. Within its shade we live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. It well recalls the triumphs past. It gives us hope of peace at last. The banner bright, the symbol plain, of human right and human gain. Then raise the scarlet standard high. Within its shade we live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. It suits today the weak and base, whose minds are fixed on pelf and place. You cringe before the rich man's brown, to haul a sacred emblem down. Then raise the scarlet standard high. Within its shade we live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. With life uncovered swear we all, to bear it onward till we fall. Come dungeons dark or gallows grim, this song shall be our parting hymn. Then raise the scarlet standard high. Within its shade we live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. Yes. All right. Very good. And after Joti's amazing speech that's coming up, we will then sing the second song, Whirlwinds of Danger, which might be a little bit harder because not all of us know the tune, but I think there's enough people here that know the tune. Are there people here who know that tune? Yeah, there's enough people here who know the tune that we'll figure it out. But I'm just going to be a little bit brief and just kind of give some background. So the Center for Political Innovation is not a political party. We are a socialist educational think tank. And we were formed because there's a job that needs to be done. And that job is educating people about socialism and doing so in an anti-imperialist way. And that job desperately needs to be done because millions of young people and older folks and people of all ages in this country are getting interested in socialism and revolutionary politics. But there's a lot of confusion. And the danger of a new world war is hanging over us. And there's a lot of confusion. One of the main principles of Marxism-Leninism, of progressive revolutionary organizing, is that you never side with your own imperialist bourgeoisie. When the big bankers and monopolists are taking aim at some country, our job is not to line up with them. Our job is to say that our real enemy is at home. Our real enemy is at home, and that the soldiers should turn their guns around, right, and make war against the war makers. And we all remember how in 1917 that happened, right? The Bolshevik Revolution happened because of that, because the Russian people didn't want to keep fighting a war against their neighbor in Germany. And the Bolsheviks said, let's make war against the war makers, down with war, and they made history. And history has marched forward largely because of people having that courage. So I'm just going to quickly go over some of the history of international organizing, right? We know about Karl Marx. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in the year of 1848. 1848 was the year he published the Communist Manifesto. And 1848 was the year of the Spring of Nations, because all across Europe there were uprisings taking place. People were rebelling and rising up, demanding the creation of modern nation states. And the biggest uprising of that year was the German Revolution of 1848 that failed. And Karl Marx and his comrades, they had their own faction that was part of the German Revolution of 1848, and they lost, and so they fled, and then they published the Communist Manifesto to lay out their principles and what they believed. And the opening line of the Communist Manifesto, he says, "A specter is haunting Europe," meaning that already the ideas that he was putting forward were so widespread, and there was such a demand from the working class that they have the right to decent housing, healthcare, and education, that they organize and resist the power of their employers. There was so much of a demand for that that the ideas were so widespread that the Communist League was giving voice to sentiments that were widespread already at the time. And Marx felt that borders needed to be transcended, and that dividing workers upon nationality was a setback, right? And that, that the workers in Germany had more in common with the workers in France than with the workers in Italy than they did with their bosses. And so Karl Marx established the International Working Men's Association, which is the first international, it was called. And the first international was established, and it was a network of parties around Europe, people around Europe that were fighting for the working class, organizing labor unions. Well, the first international fell apart because it was dominated by anarchists, folks who did not want to go into the labor movement, folks who didn't want to participate in elections, folks who just wanted to kind of scream bloody revolution and advocate violence and terror and such. And so eventually the first international collapsed. But around the time that Marx was dying, around the time Engels was still alive, you had the very beginnings of what was then called the Second International, or the Socialist International. And that was another international association that came into being at the end of the 1800s. And the Second International proliferated like crazy. All over Europe, you had Marxist and socialist groups that were massive. Labor unions were being formed. People were elected to the parliaments. And, every major European country had, they had a socialist faction in their parliament. They had communist marching bands and communist choirs. And there was a huge grouping called the Second International. And in Britain, you had the Labour Party that came out of the Second International. And in Germany, you had the Social Democratic Party that came out of the Second International. And all these parties claimed that they were believers in Marxism, believers in socialism, parties of the working class. And they all promised that they would never send workers to kill each other in a war. They pledged they would never support an imperialist war. But we all know that when situations get tough, divisions happen, and some people don't stay true to their principles. And as as World War I was approaching, all of these big parties, all these big Marxist parties in Europe started selling out and abandoning their principles. And Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, and Vladimir Lenin in Russia, and Eugene Debs here in the United States, they refused to budge. And they said, we are going to oppose World War I. We will never support an imperialist war. But the rest of the socialist leaders, they sold out. And that a lot of these socialist groups were dominated by what they called the aristocracy of labor, workers that had higher pay. And because they had their higher pay, they looked down on workers of lower pay and sympathized with their bosses. And this process of corrupting revolutionary working class parties and making them tools of imperialism led to World War I. And Lenin, if you want to read some angry writing, go and read Lenin's writings from that time period. He was furious that all these parties, he knew for a fact that World War I would never have happened if it hadn't been for the fake socialists who had supported it. If the socialist parties had not rallied the workers to support World War I, World War I could have been prevented. But it was because of the sellout leaders that World War I happened. So then, of course, we had the Russian Revolution. But when Lenin went back to Russia in April of 1917, on the cusp of the revolution, he said, we've got to change our name. We can't be associated with these social democratic leaders that sold out and abandoned the working class and supported the war. And that's why the Bolsheviks, they had originally been called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Well, they changed their name to the Communist Party so that no one would associate them with the sellout reformist leaders. They were a different group. And then we know what happened is the Russian Revolution was successful, and then they launched the Third International. The Third International was formed, and the Third International was the Communist International. And all over the world, new parties came into existence that carried with them that revolutionary anti-imperialism, that understanding that the main threat to humanity is the big bankers and corporations and monopolies based in the Western countries that are keeping the world poor and grinding countries into poverty, and that it was the duty of all of us who believe in growth and human progress to stand shoulder to shoulder with people in Africa and Asia and Latin America that are fighting for their independence and development, and that the working class in the Western countries must align with the people of the colonized world in their fight for national liberation. That was the foundation of the Third International. Interesting fact is the South African Communist Party, when it was first formed, it was a settler country, South Africa. They had white supremacy written into their founding documents. And Lenin said, well, you can't be a member if you have white supremacy written into your founding documents because we believe in the liberation of the entire working class. And so the South African Communist Party had to be completely reformed on an anti-racist platform. They had 21 points for admission into the Communist International. And the communist parties of the world are largely the parties that were formed as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution and this new formation of parties that took to heart the anti-imperialist principles that had made the Russian Revolution and that the Second International, the Social Democrats, have abandoned. Well, there's a lot more history between 1917 and today, and Joti's going to get into that. But the main reason that this organization, the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, has been formed is because many of those parties that were part of that Third International, that were founded in opposition to social democracy and founded in opposition to imperialist war, have become supporters of U.S. imperialism and its proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. Or they've become neutral, and they've tried to claim that somehow Russia is imperialist or China is imperialist. Or they have found some way to compromise. Well, the World Anti-Imperialist Platform is an organization of parties and revolutionary activists from around the world who say that if World War III does come, there's one side that's right and there's one side that's wrong. If there's a fight over Taiwan, China is right and the U.S. imperialists that are backing Taiwan are wrong. And what is going on right now in Ukraine, right? We know who's right, is that the Russian people and the people of the eastern regions that are fighting for their protection, they're right, and the puppet regime of the United States is wrong. And on the Korean Peninsula, if a fight breaks out there, the people of North Korea that have been bombarded and attacked and subject to horrendous sanctions, and the people of South Korea that host U.S. troops that are there, well, North Korea is right, and South Korea, the people there that live under U.S. occupation, that government there is not legitimate, and the people of South Korea have the right to stand with their northern country folk, and Korea is one country. These are the principles on which the World Anti-Imperialist Platform was signed. So when I heard about it, when we heard about it at the Center for Political Innovation, we said we have to get involved. We want to get involved. And so shortly after it was founded, Joti came to our conference last March, our Summit Against Hypocrisy in Washington, D.C., as a representative. And just recently, they had their World Congress, and Elizabeth Young, our president, represented us at the World Congress of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform in Athens, Greece, gave a dynamic presentation about opportunism that's available on the website and such. And so that's why we're here. And, you know, Joti is speaking tomorrow as the representative of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, and as the representative of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. She came all the way from London to come here and give this presentation, and we thought it just wasn't enough, you know. Tomorrow, Joti is going to speak for 20 or 25 minutes, but if she's coming all the way from London, we can't just have her speak for just 20 and 25 minutes, especially since she's so dynamic and since she's so amazing and she's been, you know, standing up for anti-imperialism. So we called up our friends from the Party of Communist USA, and I called up Elizabeth, and we arranged to have this meeting here tonight, so that Joti could give a full-length presentation about anti-imperialism, about the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, and about why we need revolutionary anti-imperialist politics. Her organization, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, has been fighting for anti-imperialism. They heroically stood against the destruction of Libya. They stood with Syria as the U.S. imperialists were fomenting war there. They've been on the side of the people of Donbass as the imperialists fomented their war in Ukraine. And so we're really honored to have Joti here tonight with us. She's going to give us a great presentation. And tomorrow, we are having the National Convention of the Center for Political Innovation. That's why many of us are here from out of town. And thank you, everyone who's here from out of town. So after the meeting tonight, I understand there's a lot that still needs to be done. So don't leave as soon as Joti's done, because we have to assign some tasks and get everything in order, because there's a lot that needs to be done for tomorrow. The event tomorrow happens at the Tumwater Ballroom in Oregon City. As of now, there are 156 people registered to attend on the website. Scott Ritter is coming into town. He's arriving. His flight arrives in a few hours. We've got Garland Nixon, who's here tonight, great radio host, from Sputnik and anti-imperialist. In addition to that, we've got Syed Hosseini, who's a very important Iranian-American, commentator and anti-imperialist. In addition to that, we've got Lee Stranahan from Sputnik Radio. David Rovics, the great musician who is local, is going to be performing throughout the day. It's going to be a really, really great event. So, yeah, that's really all I've got to say for tonight. And I thank you all for being here, and I hope that you can all help us out with things as we prepare for tomorrow. So I guess Sam is going to give a formal introduction to Joti, and we'll go from there. Sam?
Yeah. So Joti wished to sit, so there will be an adjustment in a moment. But let me give my intro. As Caleb mentioned, she did fly all the way in from England just to deliver this important message. Joti's been all around lately. Athens, Greece, where Liz was able to join them, and this is such an important message that the World Anti-Imperialist Platform is spreading. Joti is the official spokesperson for the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, spreading this message of peace and prosperity, and that there can be a new world. And this is just a reminder, if you're American, you should say her name right. It is Joti Brar. One other thing I wanted to mention is the recent arrest of her brother, Ranjit Brar, for spreading anti-Zionist pamphlets. The British government is trying to criminalize anti-Zionism in order to shut it down. And they will not succeed. They will not succeed. Anyway, Joti, I'm gonna set you up. We're gonna set you up a little bit, but yeah, let's give her a round of applause.
Sorry to get carried with your lovely setup here. That's good.
Elizabeth, it's flexible.
Since I was asked to speak for a considerable period of time, I thought sitting down would be more appropriate. Also, I tried to make some notes in the hope that I will stick to my speech and not just go rambling off. It may or may not work.
Thank you.
I'm going to kick all these flexes down here. Hi. Now. So, I hope I've got the pitch of this right. It's very hard to know who's going to be in the audience for something and how many things they know. So if you feel like I'm patronising the hell out of you and telling you a bunch of things you know, feel free to say, like, move it over. No.
Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. I feel like you can hear me.
Oh,
Is that all right?
if it's good, it's good.
Everybody here fine? So, I was thinking about why are we here today? And obviously, it seems obvious to me, the reason we're here is that we share a concern about what's going on in the world today, and we want to do something. We want to be part of making a positive change. You've heard already speakers talk about, the need for peace and prosperity. But obviously the question is, how do we get there? Where do we start? And it can be hard to tell because, there's so much conflicting information. So how do we judge what's right? How do we work out where we can most usefully put our energies? The ruling class wants us to think that we can understand the world just by looking around us. But that's not true. Just like we can't understand the laws of, physics by just looking at, water in the sea or, there's laws underpinning the motions that we observe with our eyes that need to be unpicked and discovered in order for us to then be able to look again at what we see with our eyes and make sense of it in a whole higher level. And, the news cycle, the ruling classes are bombarding our senses with information all the time. The news cycle, social media, they combine and they create this huge and very effective distraction machine. And it prevents us from asking ourselves, whose priorities are we responding to? Who makes the news cycle? Who decides what's on the front pages of the newspapers? Are they actually the things that matter? Now, even without looking that deeply, just stepping back out of some of that, flick, 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 read, look over here, the noise of all of that, and stop and think for a minute, we can see that the things we're being bombarded with and that are being shouted about to make us feel that they're important and urgent are not the most important things. The big stories in the world get hardly any coverage. The real important, in terms of how many lives they affect, how many people are suffering, stories don't get talked about. So, we can't make sense of surface phenomena unless we understand what's happening underneath. And this is where Marxist science comes in. And if you've heard me speak before, you'll have heard me talk about this before, so apologies. As my father likes to say, repetition is the key to learning. I can't apologise really for bringing this message to the workers in the West because we really need to hear it. And we need not just to hear it, but to act on it. It's Marxist science that reveals to us the underlying laws which allow us to make sense of the world we live in. There are laws that explain the operation of capitalist economics, the source of profit, the law of value. There are laws explaining the development of human history. It's not just a random sequence of events. It's not just about this guy or that guy, It's not a question, bourgeois history is written like this. Oh, if only Adolf Hitler had been better at art, World War II might never have happened. It's nonsensical, but that is the way they teach it. And that is what our heads are filled with. All, reams of nonsense written about World War II, but how many kids who study it at school actually know what it was about? They don't. They don't have a clue because of these ridiculous narratives. It's good for Hollywood, but we have to recognise what Hollywood is, part of the distraction machine, part of the confusion machine, part of the machine for obfuscating the fact that truth is known. It's just a truth which doesn't fit the interests of the class that currently rules our societies. And so ever since Marx discovered these important truths about economics, about history, about philosophy, about social sciences, those areas of academia have stopped being areas of real science and research and information. They've become machines for hiding information, machines for confusing and distracting, for selling nonsense and voodoo to people. It's a huge industry, it's a huge effort to hide reality, and yet reality makes itself felt all the same. Reality is very hard to kill. But of course, when it comes to understanding Marxism properly, it needs deep study, but it also needs an understanding that what you're getting is an understanding of the fundamental laws that underpin everything. What you're not going to get is a tool for making detailed predictions. You know, you get a kind of, people who have this idea of science as something that's so specific that it will, you know, just like you can't ask a physicist what direction's that quark about to move in. You know, but people want a kind of 2 + 2 = 4. They want a formula. Of course, you don't get a formula from Marxism. But the more you study and the more you combine your study with practical activity that helps you really understand what you've been studying, the better you become at combining the science with your practice of class struggle, and you start to get a feel for the art of the science. Class struggle is an art as well as a science. It involves people. You know, and a million different interactions of, you know, so many different forces at work. You have to start to, you know, be in the world doing class struggle to get a feel for how those forces interact. But Marxist science underpins your ability to do that. And that's why constantly you know, wherever I go, I remind people that at the root of everything you're trying to achieve has to be serious study of Marxism. And of course, as Lenin developed Marxism, it not only revealed the secrets of the existing state of things and charted the general line of development forwards, but Lenin explicitly explained the highest and final stage of capitalist development, which is the imperialist stage, the one that we are sadly still living in today. And it showed what effects imperialism has on the working class movement. Caleb referenced that earlier, the way that sections of the working class in the imperialist countries are bribed, are bought off and made into servants of the ruling class within the working class movement. And how effective this has been in holding our movement back, and therefore how hard we have to work to expose everything that's acting as an agent of the ruling class within our movement. We can't be successful without it. And it was Lenin's ruthless struggle against opportunism, which is what he termed that, the selling out of the long-term interests of the working class for short-term gain, for some petty privileges. This opportunism is the enemy of our movement, and it was Lenin's ruthless struggle against opportunism which laid the foundation for the success of the Bolsheviks when all the other parties failed to rise to the revolutionary opportunity that was brought by World War I. So we have to always look at imperialism in crisis in two ways. On the one hand, they bring enormous industrial scale death and devastation. It's horrific. On the other hand, along with that, they bring a great revolutionary upsurge. Every crisis of imperialism brings with it a revolutionary wave. And that's the opportunity to defeat imperialism while it's weak. There's a real opportunity. At World War I we saw it, World War II we saw it, and now in World War III we're seeing it again. Everybody here has felt the change in the conditions in which we are working. And those are only going to develop more in our favour as the coming period, the period we're now entering, develops. But then it's our job to be making sure that we're developing the forces that can take advantage of that and really inflict serious defeats on the imperialists. And that means working in our countries, and it means working around the world in a coordinated way to maximise our ability to be effective. And of course it means exposing the forces within our own movement who are helping the imperialists rather than helping the cause of the working class. So the ruling class wants to hide from us the existence of this valuable weapon of socialist theory. They want us to feel alienated not only from the idea of Marxism in general, but even from the idea of study of anything. You know, they've done an amazing job, I think, with, on the one hand, under conditions of capitalism, because of the Soviet Union, never forget that, in the Western imperialist countries, we got a whole lot of concessions to buy social peace because of the Soviet Union and the threat, the example that it offered to the working class. It showed them that they could get the things that they needed if they overthrew their rulers. And their rulers in the West said, oh shit. And they were in real trouble. There were real revolutionary crises after World War I and after World War II in all the European countries. And after World War II, with the help of US imperialism, which was the only imperialist power that came out of those wars stronger, all the other imperialist powers were weakened by World War I and weakened still more by World War II. In Europe, mainland Europe, no imperialist power would have stayed standing after World War II if it wasn't for the USA. What I think is really interesting about the period we're coming into is US imperialism is in decay and decline. It's very, very clear to everybody that that's the case. And there's no strong imperialist power waiting in the wings to come and bail the USA out when it goes under. There's a real possibility in that. Think about that when you're feeling overwhelmed by the difficulties of the tasks facing you. Everything is changing. The imperialism is going into the biggest crisis ever yet. It's so rotten ripe for revolution. The forces that are going to destroy it are rising all around the world. And if we ally ourselves with those, there's absolutely a chance that in this coming revolutionary wave, the biggest, strongest imperialist power is going to be defeated and destroyed. That's a real possibility to put your focus on here inside the USA. You're going to be pivotal to that, okay? So you've got to be rising to that challenge. But there's understand, if you look at it in the big picture, that's not a kind of distant dream. That's a genuine reality of the period that we're entering into now. The imperialists are not having things all their own way. One of the signs that we're living at the end of the era of imperialist domination is that in spite of their huge machinery of mind control, the truth is harder and harder for the ruling class to hide. And many important truths have been brought to us by the failure of imperialist operations and wars to go as they were planned. You know, it's built into their mindset that the bourgeoisie constantly overlooks the actions of the masses. They consistently fail to understand that we're living in the era of national liberation. The era of national liberation began, anybody want to tell me when? October 1917. Earlier. It was the October Revolution that set the world on fire and ended for good the idea that anybody is superior to anybody else, that people who've been colonized have to just put up with it because they're inferior. There's no people will accept that anywhere on the earth anymore because of October. And we can see that by the way that even since the fall of the Soviet Union, when the US and the imperialist camp were aggressively striding the world, saying, now's our chance to stamp out every area of resistance to our rule, now's our chance to topple every regime that's in our way, and they launched their wars and they launched their invasions, what happened? They were defeated everywhere. After Yugoslavia, which is the one horrible exception. After Yugoslavia, they were defeat after defeat after defeat. And each time they're defeated, there's recriminations. If there was, and you can compare Yugoslavia to Iraq to understand. Yugoslavia, they got what they wanted, they got it quickly. Everybody was united in the imperialist media and the imperialist political circles that the war was a jolly good idea and victory was the right thing, and nobody talked about the real costs of that war. The lies that had driven that war, what the real aims of that war were, what terrible damage it had done to the people, what poison it left behind it. None of that really is talked about still in our media because it was a quick victory, they got what they wanted. But in all the other places they've gone to war, where they didn't get quick victories and they didn't get what they wanted, what starts to happen after a year or two? The recriminations start. And when the ruling class is fighting itself, then we get information in the mainstream media, which is not our media, it's their media. It's the organ of their democracy, where their arguments happen between factions of the ruling class. But when the ruling class is fighting itself, information, while they're slinging mud, they sling accusations, you start getting leaks. People start telling you things that otherwise they wouldn't tell you about what the discussions really were before they launched the war, about who really knew what, about what crimes they're committing and who's committing them. And all of this information ends up in the public domain for the workers to see and understand and digest. So our rulers consistently fail to understand we're living in this era of national liberation. That no matter how much death and devastation an aggressive imperialist army inflicts from the air, no matter how much suffering its occupation forces inflict on civilian populations in targeted countries, in the end they're not going to win. And 20 years of war in Afghanistan, which by the way followed 20 years of destabilization of Afghanistan, also caused by the USA, US imperialists. So 40 years of warfare to try to control Afghanistan and stop it being an independent country failed. Yes, they inflicted tremendous devastation. Yes, they held back the country's development enormously, ruined its economy, deprived 2 generations of people of the opportunities they should have had. And famously, what we always talk about, with Kalashnikovs and flip-flops on their feet, the Afghans inflicted defeat, a serious defeat, on the US Army and its allies, and kicked them out. And the scenes of their exit were reminiscent of the exit of the US forces from Saigon. It was a real rout in the last days. So this is the most recent example of a lesson that actually has been hitting the imperialists over the head for decades. You'd think they would have learnt it after Korea. Nope. After Vietnam. Nope. After Iraq. After Syria. They can't learn the lesson because their mindset doesn't allow them to learn the lesson. Their interest, their vested interests don't allow them to see this truth. They don't see human beings as equal. They don't see the oppressed peoples as having rights. They can't, or they wouldn't be able to stay in their position as the rulers of this insanely unequal, inhuman system. So they have to have a mindset, a supremacist mindset, a mindset that discounts the lives of ordinary people. But when these truths emerge, they're creating a growing cynicism amongst working people. We start to see that we're not listened to. We start to see that our democracy, so-called, means nothing. We start to see that our politicians and media lie and that they don't serve the masses. They serve a very small ruling class whose interests are not ours. So there's this growing crisis of legitimacy. And we also see that there's a total lack of accountability for those politicians and media, even after it becomes in the public domain, that they've lied, that they've committed war crimes, that they all have blood on their hands, that at Nuremberg they'd be hung. And yet they're feted and celebrated. Tony Blair, George Bush, they're rewarded over and over and over again. Why? Because they're loyal servants of the ruling monopolists. this is becoming clear to more and more people. And meanwhile, those who tell the truth are vilified. So there's a lesson to be learned from this. There is no way to oppose the system and stay respectable, right? There's no point saying or thinking you're working for socialism and trying to tailor your message in such a way that they'll let you on the mainstream media. Mm-hmm. They won't.
Right.
They won't. They won't. It's incompatible, right? It's incompatible. So anybody who tells you that, what you need to do, walk away now. You're getting nowhere with those people. I've had it myself. I've been told, oh, Joti, you're great, but it would be much easier if you would, you'll appeal to more people. It's very boring for everybody when you start mentioning Marx and Lenin. Don't do it, because, it shuts people down. They don't want to listen. They're not interested. No. This is not the case. We mustn't patronise the working class and imagine they're not capable of understanding the truth. If you know the truth, your job is to bring it to people. And if you're not bringing it, you're saying there's something to be ashamed of. And that is just reinforcing the bourgeois propaganda. That's not helping the working class understand how to liberate itself. Ultimately, it's the workers who are going to make the revolution, not you and me. We're here to help them understand how, and to help them understand that they are the motive force of history. They are the ruling class in waiting. They have to feel that. They have to believe it's true. Those of us who do understand it, it's our job. It's our job to take that message to people, not to hide it, not to patronise people, not to set ourselves up as gurus. I'm the holder of the truth, but I'm not going to tell it to you. You just ask me if you need to know anything. No, that's not our job. So we can't oppose the system and stay respectable. We have to recognise the truth of the Third International slogan from the 1930s, it's class against class. We have to bring that understanding to the workers who've been devoid of decent leadership in the West for a long time. Class against class. The ruling class knows it. They act on it all the time. We have to learn it. We have to bring that truth to the working class. Our interests are not the interests of our rulers. We've got to learn from the history of the 20th century. The biggest enemy of the present rulers of the world is communism. If you look a little bit deeper into the history of what they call the Cold War, you'll see that it's really a misnomer. There's nothing cold about what happened after World War II. Endless wars of extermination waged against communists all over the world. These are hidden from the masses. We have to bring this truth to them and show them why. Why have they targeted and exterminated communists in every part of the globe? From the USSR and China during World War II, who lost so many millions in defeating fascism and fighting for socialism, to the post-war massacres of communists in Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Laos, East Timor, the Philippines, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Iraq, Sudan. In every liberation movement in Asia and Africa, communist or socialist leaders have been killed by US operations, or some operation allied to or under the direction of the USA. The movements they led were met with huge and ruthless violence. Most notorious and bloody, and yet almost unknown to ordinary people in the West, is the massacre of 1 million communists and communist sympathisers in Indonesia in 1965. Now, I can see lots of nodding in here. You're a knowledgeable audience. But go into the street and ask people if they know what happened in Indonesia in 1965. What will they say to you?
Huh?
What? Where? Who? The most phenomenal thing about these massacres beyond the fact that so many of them took place and so many communists have been wiped out in the 20th century, is how little they are known about, talked about, discussed. And even when books are published about them, the readership is so narrow. And the news media and Hollywood, they pass right over all of that stuff. The school syllabuses, the history books that our kids study, even into degree level, don't talk about them. There's a general blanket silence. Instead, we get this constant myth that it's communism that presents a threat to humanity. Now, everybody's heard of the Black Book of Communism, right? Mm-hmm. Yes? Everybody. And most people on the streets have heard of it, right? So they have this total projection, in fact. Now, Caleb referred to the first line of the Communist Manifesto. The threat of communism is real. That's why the Communist Manifesto starts the way it does. It was written 175 years ago. But the threat is not to the workers, it's to the capitalists. To their continued existence as a parasitic and privileged caste, receiving all the gains of society's efforts and performing none of its work. Meanwhile, the imperialists are constantly providing fresh proof of what they showed us in World War I, that there is no limit to the human sacrifice they're prepared to make in pursuit of their aims. Their aim of total world domination, their aim of staying on top of this insanely unequal society. How many Ukrainians have been sacrificed because the imperialists were determined to smash Russia? And when they've run out of Ukrainians, will they stop? No. They're grooming populations all over Eastern Europe to be the next to be thrown into the trenches. Do they care? No. Joe Biden says it's a good investment. What happened to protecting Ukraine? If every Ukrainian dies, it's a good investment for us. Don't worry about it. This is exactly the same mentality that became so notorious after World War I of the European generals and politicians who hurled thousands and thousands of men in front of machine guns endlessly. It looked like they were just fighting over this, little patches of scrub. The men there couldn't understand what this was all about. But of course, what they were really fighting over was the right to colonial loot. Who is going to get the biggest share of the world's markets and colonies? That's what they were fighting over. They didn't care how many working class people they sacrificed to come out on top of that fight. Right now we've been watching, that sounds horrible, doesn't it? Like it's an entertainment. We've been seeing Palestinians being slaughtered on the same altar because the imperialists are desperate to hold on to their colonial outpost in the Middle East. They don't care what the human cost of that is. They've made that clear. The Arab peoples, the Middle Eastern peoples have been suffering for a century because the resources in the Middle East are so important to imperialism that they mustn't be allowed to be under the control of the people who live there. And in order for them not to be under their control, they will do anything. The imperialists will do anything to keep hold of the control and the right to loot those resources. And the same sentiment was expressed by Madeleine Albright, wasn't it? At the time of the sanctions war against Iraq, when she was asked directly after a report came out that said 500,000 children had been killed because of sanctions. And of course, I'm sure it was much more. And she said, yes, we think the price is worth it. And what about Hillary Clinton? We're constantly, the imperialists, they're on the back foot. And one way they're on the back foot is that they have to dress themselves up in our clothing. They have to try and present themselves as the bearers of progress. Why? Because it's been generally understood by the working class that progress is what we want. The reality is progress in social terms, in reality, means socialism. Moving moving forward, progressing forward from capitalism to socialism. That is progress. The ruling class understand that this has become the popular consciousness around the world, including in the imperialist countries. We know we need progress. But having managed to get rid of so many of the good class-conscious leaderships, they're able to take on our clothing and dress themselves up as the bearers of progress. And how do they do that? They say, oh, we're against racism. Look, here's a black president. We're against racism. Look, here's a presidential candidate who's a lady. I remember my daughter when she was in primary school coming home and telling me, oh, Mum, it's really good, you know. I heard in assembly today, remember she's like 10, I heard in assembly today that America's might be about to elect its first woman president. And I'm there, maybe I didn't have to do this, but I felt like I had to sit her down and explain to her that there's nothing good about Hillary Clinton getting elected to the White House. She's a war criminal. But it's all right, she's a woman. So that's all right. But I remember the footage of Hillary. I mean, Caleb talked about the fact that my party stood with Libya in its hour of need. I remember the footage that went viral around the internet of Hillary Clinton watching a video of the murder of the Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi, and laughing and saying, we came, we saw, he died. These are the voices. This is the face of the imperialist system in its decline and decay. It has nothing to offer the people. It's clear. It represents only death, destruction. It can only offer us hate, infighting, poverty, crisis, war. We need our own media. And we need one that's not just independent, but Marxist. You know, the whole kind of, I don't want to damn them all, right? Lots of independent media do good things, but it's based on a fundamental falsehood, which is we have to be independent of politics, which means we mustn't be overtly Marxist, because that's picking a side. Wrong. Fail. If you don't pick Marxism in an imperialist country, you're reinforcing anti-communist propaganda. You have accepted the premise that communism is somehow bad and that to openly side and come out as a Marxist is to be somehow having a bias. Yes, everything does have a bias. There's no such thing as neutrality. And if you claim to be neutral, what you will actually find is, in some way or another, you're reinforcing the propaganda of the ruling class. And one of the ways you can see that is the fact that so much of our independent media, even the best of them, they exude pessimism, not optimism. And the reason for that is they're overwhelmed by all the things which are wrong. They report on them, they see them, but instead of offering answers, they just give you hand-wringing. There's a kind of conscience salving of like, well, I don't agree with all of this. It's horrible, it's bad. Oh, war is bad. Imperialism's not very nice. If only we could go back to when things were nicer. This in itself is an imperialist prejudice. You know, the workers had a period of being bought off after World War II in Western countries. And the idea that we just want to go back to a state of having a better bribe, it's like one of my comrades says, you know, it's like asking for padding on your chains. We've seen where that led to. The bribe was temporary. They can't keep it up. They're taking it away. And while we were getting bribed, the people in the colonies were getting murdered. Is that the trade-off we want to make? Is that the world we want to continue living in? Where did it get us? Only to here. In the end, you can't solve your problems by selling out to the system. So we need a Marxist media. We need one that offers people class-conscious understanding and answers. And we need to be prepared to take on the big lie, the one they repeat to us every day from birth if we live in the West. Communism, the USSR, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Kim Il-sung, Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, these are all representatives of the ultimate evil, right? The societies they built were the worst kind of authoritarian dystopian hell. What nonsense. But we have to be prepared to say so. How will people find out if no one is brave enough to stand up to the big lie machine? Actually, people are ready to hear the truth if you're prepared to tell it to them. But you have to be prepared and not scared, not embarrassed, not ashamed, confident, positive, hopeful, optimistic. The Soviet Union in the time of Joseph Stalin, God, what wouldn't I give to live in a society like that? It was amazing. There's a million things to tell people about what they achieved, what they showed us, about what we can be and what we can do, what humanity is really capable of. You know, and help people to see that this massive lie is the number one lie peddled by the bourgeoisie because it hides the number one most important truth that workers need to understand, which is that socialism, a planned economy run by and for the working masses, is the answer to all the contradictions that have been produced by the capitalist system, but which the capitalist system is incapable of resolving. Only a planned economy can take these huge means of production that the capitalist system has produced and use them to satisfy the needs of the workers, can create the conditions for a decent life for every person on the planet, can give them rising material and cultural conditions, meaning, purpose, community, cooperation, without exploitation, without the oppression of one person or one nation by another. You know, and as time passes, the contradictions of capitalism get worse, because the longer that capitalism exists for, the more wealth accumulates. The wealth of the world is massing into bigger and bigger fortunes in fewer and fewer hands. And as this takes place, the inescapable and glaring inequalities just become more so. You know, last time I was here, Caleb was explaining about the source of profit and how that's the fundamental core of the contradictions in the system that we live in. You know, if you just look at one working day in a capitalist enterprise, what you'll find is the worker comes to work and produces an amount of value. New values are produced by his work. And a part of that goes to paying for his wages, and another part goes to the capitalist for free. Now, you only have to multiply that by all the people working and all the days of working and put it over time to understand that as time goes by, more and more and more and more of the wealth of society ends up in the hands of the owners of the means of production. And the workers are working to stand still if they're lucky, and actually, in fact, to go backwards, whilst an increasing share of society's wealth that's produced by the work of these workers goes into the hands of the capitalists. But more than that inequality, which is baked into production for profit, and you can't get rid of it because that is the essence of it, is the fact that the workers have not been paid, their wages are only a proportion of the wealth that's produced, but the wealth is produced in the form of things that need to be sold. It stands to reason they can't buy back the products that have been produced. So this crisis, the crisis of overproduction, is built in, baked into the bones of the capitalist system. Again, if you're producing for profit for the market, you can't get rid of this contradiction. Marx explained this 150 years ago, and the ruling class ever since has been busy trying to hide it. There is no escape within a market economy from the contradictions produced by production for profit in the market. So, you know, since the beginning of the 20th century, the only respite from all this crisis has been created by war. Respite not for us, for the rulers of the system. By the carnage and destruction that war creates on an industrial scale. It's the only way they've been able to kickstart demand. First for armaments and then for reconstruction. Arms and reconstruction, that's how they get the economy going again, and then it goes, it's temporary. And they slide back into crisis and another war, arms, reconstruction, another, you know. And right now, this system is teetering on the brink of another extremely violent downturn. You think things are bad now, but you know the crash that's coming is going to be the biggest ever, and its effects are likely to make 2008 look like a walk in the park. You know, not only have they created an inflation crisis with endless money printing, and remember that was their response to 2008, but they've been devaluing the main imperialist currencies, and especially the dollar, since 2008. And now it's coming back to bite them, and inflation is out of control. But their only response to every crisis now is more money printing. So that inflation is going to keep ramping up. Not only are workers saddled with huge debts, because actually they can't afford to live on their wages anymore. And those debts are going to turn bad as the inflation continues to rise. But corporations all over the globe have been borrowing to fund dividend payments, to make it look like they're still profitable. They're literally taking out loans and just giving them to shareholders as dividend. Now what happens to those companies when they have to pay back those loans? What happens to the whole shebang? All this debt is going to turn out to be unserviceable. And on top of all of that, the money jugglers in the corporate casinos have taken to doing this thing, like, you know, they do this gambling, they call it future, they bet on the future prices of commodities, right? It's a gamble. Future, thank you. Futures derivatives. Yeah, right. Now they've come up with this brilliant wheeze where they insure their bet. So if the bet goes wrong, they get a payout. Right? Brilliant. Except the vehicles they're using for the insurance are themselves based on the same CDOs that underpinned the mortgage boom that preceded 2008, right? Remember after that, everyone was like, oh, how was this allowed to happen? You know why? Because they're just keeping the show on the road any way they can. They just go from quarter to quarter. If I can find a way to make a profit this quarter, that'll do. And as long as the profits, the dividends keep getting paid out, nobody's going to argue. And then when it all goes up in smoke, when there's a big crash, everyone's like, oh, turning around looking for the person to blame. Those same mechanisms, the CDOs they used, that were then just being used to underpin the mortgage dodgy lending, are now being used to underpin the insurance against the derivative bets in every single important commodity market in the global economy. And it only takes one big shock in one of those markets for the whole thing to come crashing down. And there's insiders talking about it right now. We can expect this to happen any time. And that's on top of the bad debt, which could also be triggered by anything, anytime. And remember, we've already seen the beginnings of that debt crumbling. Various banks folded beginning of this year. You remember that? And it was very quickly hushed up by the media. And the governments moved from saying, oh, £75,000, or I don't know what they say here in your dollars, but of your deposits for every person is insured, don't worry, to saying, quietly saying, we will insure every single pound, every single dollar of every single person's deposit in every bank. How can they do that? There's only one way: money printing. So, we don't know how many dollars got printed to bail out the 3 banks that collapsed earlier this year, but you can bet it was a hell of a lot. And you can bet that's the only plan they've got for every crisis that comes from now on. Okay? Remember Weimar Germany. Eventually, that's where money printing leads you. They thought they came up with a magic trick in 2008 because they did so much money printing and it didn't seem to rebound on them. The reason it didn't seem to rebound was because the dollar is a world currency and they were exporting their inflation to the world. Now the whole world has an inflation crisis and it's inescapable and it's growing because they haven't stopped money printing. They talked about stopping and then Ukraine started. And guess what? Oh no, first it was COVID and they printed a load of money to subsidize all the failing businesses. There was a big crash and then there were lockdowns. Now remember that was the order it happened in. They weren't interested in doing targeted lockdowns as a health measure. They did national lockdowns when it was too late to control the spread of the virus, pretending it was a health measure, in reality to cover the fact that there was a big stock market collapse and they were bailing out a whole load of corporations. They called it a COVID bailout, it was not. They didn't spend money to save the people's health. They spent a whole load of money on bailing out failing corporations. So all of this comes as a side effect. All this gambling and all these derivatives and all these crazy activities that happen in the stock market, they're a side effect of the crisis, of the lack of productive ways to make a profit. So one thing is for sure, as long as the system remains in place, it's the workers who are expected to pay the price for the failures of the system through this inflation, which is theft of people's wages and savings, right? Through austerity, through reduction in pay levels, through the extension of the working day, through the destruction of our social services, through unemployment, homelessness, hunger, disease, poverty, and war. All because the huge wealth that the working class produces ends up in the hands of a tiny monopolist clique that's unable to use that wealth constructively to the benefit of humanity, to the benefit even of the workers who produced it. And it's not because they're bad people, although it's clear that the system does tend to turn ruling elites into sociopathic lunatics, but because it's the nature of the system, right? So we have to recognize we're not targeting this individual or that individual. If we replace this man or this man, if we elect this person to the position or that person to the position, again, if you study Marxism, you understand the nature of the state. You know, we can't expect to vote our way to socialism. It's a different system entirely that requires different institutions to run it. Institutions for the exercise of power by the masses are different to institutions of control of the masses by a minority. You can't turn one into the other. You have to abolish one set and create a new set. That's the truth that has to be taken to the working class. This constant keeping them on the cycle of the bloody... I mean, in this country, you're always in an election cycle. It's all anyone ever talks about.
Big business.
It's an endless circus of distraction. It's a charade. And it's clear from Donald Trump's presidency. The president isn't in charge. It's clear from Joe Biden's presidency. The president isn't in charge. It doesn't matter who. You could elect Karl Marx. Wouldn't change anything, right? You could fill up your two houses of representatives with working class people who wanted socialism. And they would suddenly find nothing was changing. It's a massive circus. And it's our job to show that to the workers and not to prettify the circus, not to reinforce their illusions in bourgeois democracy, that it's something that can be turned to the benefit of the working class. It can't. It's not its job. It's not what it was designed for. But we also have to stress that the imperialists are not all powerful. Their system is not eternal. It's the masses who make history. You know, and the push to silence debate, the push to criminalize dissent, that comes from a position of weakness, not from a position of strength. So we mustn't be cowed by it. We must recognize it's an opportunity to open the eyes of the working people, to help them to see clearly where their interests lie and organise, and not stay at home feeling weak and isolated and individual and powerless. Show them their strength. And, they will take heart if we take heart from these facts that we know and refuse to be, we're on the right side of history. This system is well past its sell-by date. It just needs a bloody good push. If we understand that and organise for it confidently and refuse to be intimidated no matter what the ruling class throws at us, we'll set an example to the people that we're trying to mobilise not to be intimidated. A whole heap of the battle, and especially in the imperialist countries, is psychological. They convince us we're isolated individuals to make us feel weak and powerless and impotent, to stop us from understanding and feeling our collective power and using it. Because the second we learn how to use that power, it's game over for the imperialists. So, we formed the platform because heading into this period of deepening crisis and accelerating war drive, there is this growing need for the workers to play their role in opposing and defeating the system. The deepening of the crisis is creating at the same time this rising tide of revolutionary sentiment and activity among the masses of the world. And remember, our movement is a global one. Just because big revolutionary outbreak has not started in the centres of imperialism doesn't mean it won't spread here. Doesn't mean that our workers here won't learn from what happens elsewhere, and especially if we're there to help them. And those of us who've understood that the movement's global, if we can connect into that network and be part of it, we'll be boosted by all of its successes. The crisis is creating conditions in which national liberation struggles and socialist revolutions will mature and will be successful in this period. So, the imperialists are driving us into economic catastrophe, into World War III. The conditions are developing for a new revolutionary wave. There's a really serious need for anti-imperialists and communists all around the world to work together. And although we work in separate countries, we recognise that our movement is one and our victories are connected. Every defeat for the imperialists abroad weakens their system. It weakens their power, weakens their ability to control and bribe the masses at home, deepens their economic and political crisis, maximises our opportunities, helps us in our efforts to organise their defeat on the home front, what Caleb talked about earlier. But of course, we can only work together internationally if we have general agreement around the key principles of who we should be fighting and how. And the founding reason for the formation of the platform was the disarray that's overtaken the communist camp in the last 75 years. It's left us far weaker than we should be and that we need to be at this time. Many parties of the Third International, as Caleb explained, are simply unable to make sense of the world. They've given in to bourgeois propaganda and defeatism about the impossibility of revolutionary struggle being successful, even about the nature of imperialism. Instead of studying Marxism and popularising it amongst their people, they just repeat bourgeois prejudices and spread defeatism, even pro-imperialist jingoism. We've seen the so-called Communist Party of France. It's still a big party. They voted war credits for the Ukraine war. They launched campaigns to defend Iranian women from the evil regime in Iran. It doesn't matter how big they are, they're useless, right? They're not what the working class needs. They're not offering the leadership that's going to help our movement get stronger. They're boosting the side of the enemy with friends like these, as they say. So this situation we face now is in fact very similar to the situation that Lenin and the Bolsheviks faced at the beginning of World War I. With the exception of the Bolsheviks, most of the big parties of the Second International, as Caleb pointed out, had become quite rotten during the preceding period of so-called peaceful development before World War I. Well, of course, just like this time, it was peaceful in Europe, not so peaceful if you happen to be a worker living in the colonies. The socialist parties during that period had become steadily institutionalised. They'd become professional. They had lots of members of parliament. They'd become accepted as the official opposition, and they were comfortable in that role. When World War I broke out, they showed their rottenness by siding with their own ruling classes and supporting the war, which only 2 years earlier they'd all sworn to oppose. They all signed up to following the strategy the Bolsheviks did of turning their guns on the ruling class and saying, no, we won't cooperate with sending workers to fight workers. We must turn the imperialist war into a civil war. We must turn it into revolution. Only the Bolsheviks implemented that program. They used the crisis to make social revolution with stunning success, with brilliant leadership. There's everything to learn from that period. I would really recommend to all of you, read, everything you can from Lenin during that whole period, during the build-up and through the whole of World War I. There's something to learn from every page of that for our situation now. But out of that period of crisis and war, out of the great revolutionary upheavals that followed it, the new international was born. Again, Caleb talked about it, the Communist or Third International. Most of the parties that made up the Third International were small in the beginning. They were formed from revolutionaries who had left the rotten old parties in Europe, or they were formed from nothing in the oppressed world, where before the October Revolution no one had heard of socialism or Marxism. And suddenly it was the new big thing. If you look at reports and pictures from the Communist Party of China, its first Congress, which ended up on a boat because it got closed down in Shanghai and they had to move to a boat on a lake nearby. There's like 21 people on the boat and 2 of them are Russian, right? And the Communist Manifesto had only been translated into China a couple of years earlier. I've actually been to the house, which is now a museum of the guy who did it. And famously, he was sat in a little shed outside his parents' house where he was doing it. And famously, he sort of accidentally kind of ate ink because he was so focused on his work. And anyway, it's a beautiful little museum. It's a wonderful piece of history. But the October Revolution brought Marxism and national liberation to the oppressed world like a thunderbolt, a lightning flash. It's set a flame in motion that is still going. Be in no doubt. But the main lesson we can learn from this period, I think, and the one that we should really take heart from, is that during a revolutionary crisis, success is not determined by what size or length of time size your organisation is, or the length of time it's existed at the beginning of the crisis. It's determined by your line and your activity in putting that line into practice. In a time of rising class consciousness and activity and deepening crisis, when developments are speeding up much faster than they've been through a preceding peaceful, very kind of stagnant period, organisations that have the correct line will be able to grow rapidly, and many big organisations that fail to rise to the challenges of the new period of intensified struggle will just fall by the wayside. That's a truth that history teaches us. That's a fundamental law of history. So we in the platform are determined to rise to the challenge of this period. We have identified that the main contradiction in the world remains that between the oppressing countries and the oppressed world. We've understood that the ultimate essence of this Third World War into which we are entering is between those two camps. We see US-led NATO imperialist bloc on the one hand, and all the forces of independence and resistance on the other. Socialist China and socialist DPRK are at the heart of that resistance group. But it's made up of every country that wants to be allowed to forge its own destiny and run its own society and economic system without interference. So there's a crucial question to answer for the platform in order to organise, and that is, what is imperialism? If we can't agree on that, we certainly won't be able to organise ourselves to resist it, and we won't be able to act together with others around the world. There's a difference between colonialism and imperialism. Colonialism went hand in hand with the earlier development of capitalism in Europe, where they were expanding their markets and looking for sources of raw materials, yes, but it was very much the export of commodities to captive markets, really. So the manufacturing was done in the imperialist countries or the capitalist countries as they were, and they captured markets to take those commodities to and sell them. And they imported raw materials. There's also a difference between slave and serf-based empires and modern imperialism. You know, modern imperialism is highly developed capitalist economy. Capitalism has concentrated wealth over time. Remember that nothing it doesn't just jump from the sky. This is a historically developed process. As capitalism continues its life, it concentrates wealth. And there comes a point where quantity transforms into quality, and all that accumulation means that what used to be an economy that was characterized by free trade has become an economy that's dominated by monopolies. And in that monopoly capitalist stage, the monopolies start to export capital rather than finished goods. They set up production all around the world, places where it's cheaper. It's cheaper because the workforce is less developed, they don't have unions, or the land is cheaper, etc., etc., etc. And the export of capital is key to this period of imperialist capitalist development. And the contradictions that this stage of development bring, with its blatant parasitism, ruthless suppression of the peoples of the world, and immense inequalities, become so unbearable that revolution becomes inevitable. And the contradictions become inescapable, because previously, every time, the capitalist system became kind of ripe, if you like, in the early 19th century. I think it's 1825 was the first crisis of overproduction in Britain. But of course, at that time, they still had a world to expand into, so they could escape their crises by expanding outwards. The problem, once we turn into the 20th century, is between them, the new imperialists, the capitalist European powers, have occupied every bit of territory of the globe. That means when the crisis comes now, it's in every corner of the globe, and there's nowhere to export to get out of the crisis. There's nowhere to go. Hence, the war to redivide the world. Hence, the need to destroy in order to create conditions for demand, to kind of reboot, if you like, the economy. In the era of imperialism, crisis becomes permanent state of things, almost impossible to get out of, and if there seems to be a boom, it's very temporary. So we live in the era of the end of capitalism and the birth of socialism. It began in 1917, and it will continue until socialism is the dominant system in the world. That is the era we live in now. And Lenin's definition of imperialism still holds true. At its core, imperialism is a global economic system. It's not a foreign policy choice. A lot of critics of imperialism come from a kind of petty bourgeois viewpoint where it's just like, big is bad, and let's just get back to small, and that would all be all right then. And also this idea that, it's Joe Biden's the problem, or this guy, Tony Blair's the problem, and if we just had the right guy who made the right choices, everything would be better. But imperialism is not a foreign policy choice. It is the historical development of capitalism reaching a certain stage. And the political and military paraphernalia that grow up alongside monopoly capitalism are there to protect the interests and the rule of the monopolists. So it's the economic development that has created all of this kind of superstructure. It's not a policy choice. And there's no way for the advanced capitalist countries to abandon imperialism within capitalism. There's only breaking the bonds of capitalism and going forward to socialism. That is why if you live in an imperialist country and you want to be an anti-imperialist, you have to be a socialist. There isn't another way to oppose imperialism in the heart, in the belly of the beast. We're not living in an oppressed country where we can form a kind of national alliance against imperialist control and oppression. We have to understand that. You know, Lenin described the main features of this global economic system. And you can see they still describe the world that we live in. He talked about the concentration of production and capital developing to such a high stage that it creates monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. Still true today? Yes. He talked about the merging of bank capital with industrial capital, which had created a financial oligarchy. Yes? Yes. The export of capital, as distinguished from export of commodities, becomes exceptionally important. Still true. He talked about how the formation of international monopolist associations sharing the world amongst themselves. Well, you know, back in the day when Lenin was writing this book, he could look at the cartels that were formed those days. They did so openly. They weren't trying to hide it. They had contracts that then they would break at a certain point when the struggle within the cartel, you know, started to break out. They would tear up the contract and go their own ways, and then they'd form a new one. But they would have lawyers draw up contracts of agreement about the sharing out of the markets and the prices between themselves. Well, in its era of being on the back foot, the imperialists now pretend to be opposed to cartels. But we know the truth. We know that underneath all of the anti-monopoly laws and the anti-cartel legislation, there are agreements between the big players in every important area of the economy about prices, about markets, market shares, about production levels, about all those things, by which means they keep their profits artificially high. Yes, and reduce the level of competition that would bring their prices down and affect their businesses. And that the territorial division of the whole world among the big capitalist powers is completed. Well, of course, that was written 1 year before the October Revolution upset the apple cart. Now there's something else that's happened, which has changed the picture somewhat, and which confuses people. Why is it that so many people in the West fall for the idea that Russia and China are imperialist powers? You know, our rulers know. I talked earlier about how they dress themselves up in our clothes. You know, they know that the masses, even at home, have learned to hate imperialism. So they manipulate this sentiment and our lack of real theoretical understanding. And they say to us, apparently in the language of anti-imperialism, they're big. They've got big militaries. Well, of course, we, living in imperialist, rapacious imperialist countries, we associate, you know, a power that's big, that has a big army, with aggression. The imperialists tell us constantly in their media, Russia's aggressive, China's aggressive, look at its big army, look at its big army, it's aggressive, it's aggressive, it's aggressive, it's aggressive. And we go, oh, aggression's bad. But they never show us the evidence. And yet, even without this evidence, just because of the endless propaganda about Russian aggression, Chinese aggression, communist forces all over the world, allegedly communist, I have to say it like that, repeat these lies instead of exposing them. In my own country, the party that claims to be the official representative of the Third International, you know, revolutionary, blah, blah, the Communist Party of Britain, says it's opposed to the war in Ukraine. But how is it opposed? It says we want peace. But it doesn't say how we're going to get peace. It says we don't like NATO expansion. But at the first point of every one of its press releases or statements about the war, it says Russian troops out. That is pure NATO propaganda, isn't it? Because what is the content of the slogan, Russian troops out? In reality, it's NATO troops in, isn't it? It's massacre of the Donbass. How do the people of the Donbass feel about the slogan, Russian troops out? Have the Communist Party of Britain gone to ask them? No. And if they did, we know what they would say to them. We have a comrade who works for RT and regularly travels to the Donbass, and he has asked communist leaders there, how do you feel when you see the Communist Party of Britain saying Russian troops out? He's shocked. He's horrified. We asked them to come here. They're protecting us. They're helping us to fight against fascism and defend our freedom, to liberate ourselves from this junta that was imposed on us by the USA, by the Europeans. The Russians are a liberating force in Ukraine. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah. Please.
I can, you know. So, you know, when you're looking at imperialism, you have to understand that it's the result of a historical process. The biggest centres of finance capital, if you look at the figures, they're the same as when Lenin was writing 100 years ago. And that's precisely because of the gravitational effect of capital. Apart from the Russian finance capital, which was in any case small compared to the main European imperialist powers, they've never been broken up. Those huge, fortunes which were already huge 100 years ago, have had another 100 years to keep growing. What effect do you think that's had on the world? They've been sucking wealth towards themselves through Wall Street, through the City of London, through the stock exchange in Berlin and Paris, sucking the wealth of the world up towards, it's a gravitational pull capital. And it's as history goes by, as day passes day, week passes week, year passes year, that just gets bigger and stronger. So without breaking apart and redistributing these huge sources of wealth, that is going to continue to be the dominant factor in every part of the global economy where capitalism is the mode of production and where the imperialists have control over the markets. On the other hand, as we said before, the world changed forever just 1 year after Lenin wrote Imperialism. And the main obstacles in today's world to imperialist hegemony have come into being not as a result of that historical process of capitalist accumulation, but as a result of socialist redistribution and socialist economic construction. The USSR, China, and the DPRK created strong militaries not to be aggressive, but to defend their socialist gains, and on the back of socialist planning and socialist technological advancement. They weren't trying to conquer anybody. They weren't pulling wealth from the rest of the world in order to build themselves up. They weren't projecting power. They were building defensive capabilities. And let's not forget that it's this basis that forms the basis of Russia's armed forces today. Okay? It has to be understood. Russia is a strange case. It's something we've never seen in the world before. A country whose economic base was built by socialism, whose socialist state has, temporarily, gone. It's run by capitalists. But the basis on which the economy was developed was socialist. It's a weird hybrid in many respects. You can't look at its big military and take the assumption that big military plus capitalist economy equals imperialism. You have to look historically and you have to look at practice. Why is it that the armed forces in Russia, just as in China and the DPRK, focus on developing cheap weapons that will be effective in defense? Supersonic, hypersonic missiles, small drones, air defense systems. Why have they built big, motivated armies that can defend their homelands? Find me one country in the world where Russian or Chinese military operate without an invitation. Can you say the same about the USA? Find me the demoralized, suicidal soldiers in their armies who don't know what they're fighting for and are appalled by the crimes that they've taken part in or witnessed. Find me the Russian and Chinese monopoly corporations that are taking over our lives and dictating to our governments. Show me the Russian and Chinese investments abroad that are bringing super profits to bribe the workers in those countries into accepting that their rulers pillage the world. On the contrary, the Russians have incensed the West by offering military protection and partnership to countries that have asked them for that partnership and assistance, helping them to keep imperialist domination at bay. And every time a country asks Russia for its help and Russia accepts, I cheer. It's brilliant. There's a little bit of breathing space being created for some countries in Latin America and in Africa from the endless suffering that they've had to endure. It's a wonderful advance, and it's disgusting that people who call themselves communists denounce it as imperialism. This is imperialist propaganda, pure and simple. They're gnashing their teeth. Good. Good. If it upsets them, good. You know, the Chinese equally have incensed the West by offering infrastructure and development help, making loans on easy terms, sharing technologies instead of controlling them. They're undercutting the imperialist technological dominance. And that's the key reason, actually, that China is targeted by the USA. On the one hand, you've got the Chinese who nearly 10 years ago now launched their Made in China 2025. What did that mean? It meant China is striving to become technologically independent by 2025. That's very close now. And on the other hand, you hear the Anthony Blinkens of this world saying, we've only got till 2025 to destroy China, or it'll be too late. What are they talking about? That's exactly what they're talking about. They're talking about technological dominance. Because without technological dominance, imperialist financial dominance is very hard to maintain. Because what is it that backs up the economic might of the imperialists? When they come with smiles and contracts on the one hand, what's behind their back? It's a gun. What makes the guns of small countries scary to big countries? They're bigger, more powerful, unanswerable. They've got the most advanced military technology. If they lose that dominance, the day is done. If I may, I want to talk a little bit about Palestine. You know, it's the same people who want us to believe that the war in Ukraine is a dispute between rival imperialist groups and the workers don't have a side. They're busy peddling this myth around the left that Hamas and Israel are as bad as each other, that both sides are in some way being manipulated by the imperialists for their own ends. It's a lie. It's a total lie. It's demobilizing the people who should be standing with Palestine, making them feel ambivalent towards the brave resistance movement. You know, the Al-Aqsa flood operation was not a terrorist crime. It was a brilliant military operation by the united forces of Palestinian resistance, not only Hamas, against the Zionist occupiers. Hamas is a legitimate resistance force, but they're not the only one. They're not the only one. And all the forces of the resistance have been working together. It's very clear if you follow closely what's happening. And not through the mainstream media, obviously. You know, you look at our mainstream media coverage, every mainstream media journalist knows their job, right? They demand of every politician and every commentator who speaks on air about Palestine, first they must denounce Hamas and agree that they're terrorists. Push the big lie. And yet, despite this endless repetition of this bullshit, the streets, even in the West, are full of people coming out to support Palestine. And they are not denouncing Hamas, all these people on the streets. They're not. The imperialists want to justify their crimes. They want to criminalize those who stand with the just cause of Palestinian liberation. And they always present the Palestinian question, just like they present every other important question. Look back to the launch of the Russian special military operation, and you'll see exactly the same thing. They abolish all context, and they act as if history started on this day. In Ukraine, history started on the 24th of February 2022. And 8 years of war, and 30, even 100 years of meddling and creating, nationalist, anti-Russian forces in Ukraine disappeared. In Palestine, 100 years of imperialist meddling, 75 years of ethnic cleansing and genocide disappeared. History started on the 7th of October, and no one can possibly understand why Hamas launched this barbaric attack on babies. Right? Shocking. They want to vanish all the context that makes sense of the situation and present this sort of insoluble narrative that's just like, the propaganda around Russia's special military operation in Ukraine was laughable, but it's kind of a case study in terms of this narrative that just says Vladimir Putin woke up one day and he was mental, right? I looked at your prestigious journal of psychiatry, Psychology Today. It's a US journal, the world-leading psychology journal. And in February and March of 2022, they carried 10 articles on the state of mind of Vladimir Putin by 10 eminent psychologists who've never met Vladimir Putin, right? All to build up, play their little part in building the imperialist wall of propaganda that said, there's no understanding this guy. There's no making sense of this. It's the Adolf Hitler myth, right? This guy just woke up one day and he was mental. And, he just decided to launch an aggressive war because he's mad. And he has to be stopped. And the poor Russian people, have to be freed from this man as well. So let's go and colonize Russia. Mm-hmm. So why, in the case of Palestine, are they so keen to suppress the Palestinian people? It's a horrible fate for the Palestinians that they happen to be sat in the place where the imperialists decided to set up their colonial outpost. It's not the Palestinians who were targeted, it's the whole Middle East. The Zionist project is about creating an army base, an armed, a loyal, armed settler outpost in the middle of a very important region because of the oil. It's the oil, stupid. If you go back to the Balfour Declaration in 1917, there was just a little bit of paper where an English minister said to the Jewish population, while another English minister was talking to the Arabs and saying, yes, we're going to help you get your liberation from the Ottomans. Balfour was writing a little memorandum of agreement with some Zionists saying, we've decided it would be a good idea for you guys to set up a little state on Palestine. Now, the Zionists have been hawking this idea around to all the imperialists. They were asking for bits of Kenya and bits of Uganda and bits of Latin America from anyone who would listen, right? They just had this idea that, Jews can't assimilate. That's a Zionist ideology. Sounds like a Nazi, right? That's the underpinning of Zionism is Jews can't be assimilated. They're special and separate, and Gentiles don't understand them and will never love them, and they'll never be safe. They have to have their special place somewhere. And they went round saying, where can we have our special place? And finally, not a coincidence that in the decade before the Balfour Declaration was signed, two things happened. Number one, oil was discovered underneath the sand that suddenly made the Arabian Peninsula much more interesting than it used to be. Before that, the only reason the British had presence on the peninsula really was Aden as a port protecting its ships that were going to India, which was the jewel in the imperial crown. They found all this oil, and also not coincidentally, the British Navy switched to oil power in 1912. 1917 they decide, after all, we will give a bit of Palestine to the Jews, or the Zionists, I should say.
1917, huh?
1917 they signed. Yeah, I know. What else happened in 1917?
Yeah.
So, you know, Zionism as an ideology was nurtured and promoted by the imperialists for their own ends. And we have to understand that. And I do recommend people get hold of a copy of our pamphlet on Zionism. It's all, you know, well-established historical fact, but it sums it up very nicely. And for those of you who haven't studied, you know, the history and the evolution of Zionism and its purpose, it's a very useful little pamphlet. Zionism does not represent Jewish people, just like Nazism does not represent German people. We have to be prepared to face down the lie that it's anti-Semitic to point out that Zionism is a racist and supremacist ideology. We have to be prepared to face down the lie that Israel has a right to exist as a racist settler colonial project. It does not. No racist settler colonial project has the right to exist. It's not anti-Semitic to demand that all of Palestine be liberated and that any Jewish people who want to stay living there must do so on terms of equality with all the other people who live there. That's not anti-Semitic. It's the opposite. We believe the Jewish people in Palestine can be saved from Zionism, and they'll be much better for it. We know we have a side in this war, just as we have a side in the war in Ukraine. You know, humanity's cause will be advanced by a victory for Russia and Ukraine, because the imperialists will suffer a terrible blow, are suffering a terrible blow. Humanity's cause will be advanced by the liberation of Palestine. You know, such a victory will be combined with the final kicking out of the imperialists from the whole of the Middle East. It's not only going to be Palestine that benefits from the defeat of Zionism, it's the whole Middle East, it's the whole of the peoples of the Arabian and wider Middle Eastern world. It will be an enormous blow to the dominance and profit-taking of the imperialists, to the whole of their system. And that means a great advance for the Arab and Middle Eastern peoples whose development has been artificially held back for a century and more. It's a weakening that will be of great benefit to the working class movement in the imperialist countries. And that's why the World Anti-Imperialist Platform has unequivocally taken the side of Russia against the Ukrainian fascists and their imperialist backers. We've taken the side of the Palestinian resistance against the Zionist fascists and their imperialist backers. And you know, the declaration on Palestine, which the World Anti-Imperialist Platform agreed on when we met in Athens, I was recently contacted by a member of the Alternative Revolutionary Path, I forget the exact name, I'm sorry, I should have written it down, for Palestine. It literally happened today, saying that they want to sign that declaration. So we're not acting out of step with Palestinian people themselves. The demands that we've recognised there are totally in accord with the demands of the programme of the Palestinian liberation movement. We will take the side of the DPRK if war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula. We will take the side of China if the USA succeeds in provoking war over Taiwan or on some other pretext, as we know they are desperate to do. We will work tirelessly to educate the masses about the real nature of the imperialist system. We will bring our message to the peace movement that the only real peace will come through defeating imperialism. Our network is growing. It's becoming more meaningful, more truly global with every month that passes. Elizabeth can tell you about the atmosphere that we felt in Athens last week, with real participation from parties across Africa, across Asia, across Latin America, bringing a real energy to our gathering and a real commitment to translate our shared line into shared action. We are committed to bringing to the workers everywhere our slogans. No cooperation with the imperialist war machine. Defeat for the fascist proxies in Ukraine and in Israel. We will work actively for the defeat for all the forces of imperialism, for the disruption and disbanding of NATO. We will work actively to combine and strengthen the forces of anti-imperialism around the world. We must expose all those who pretend to be on the side of the workers while repeating imperialist propaganda. It's an essential part of the fight for unity, the fight against imperialism, the fight for socialism. We will work to support and achieve victory for the forces of anti-imperialist resistance everywhere. You know, the objective conditions are ripening fast for a new revolutionary upsurge. There's a real possibility of a wave of critical defeats for the imperialists that could change the balance of forces definitively in favour of the working masses. The subjective force, that's working class organisation, is going to be decisive in this coming period. So comrades, now is the time to study and to organise as never before. Thank you.
Dare to struggle!
Dare to win!
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 All right. Okay. Well, I do want to just remind everybody that tomorrow we are having a huge conference, and there's a lot of things that need to be done between now and tomorrow morning. So the first thing, if you want to help us set up, we need you there at 8 a.m., right? 8 a.m. is when we can get in, and we need you there at 8 a.m. sharp as soon as the doors open, because we need you to help us set up. That's one thing that we need you to do. In addition to that, did somebody? Okay. In addition to that, we do want to remind people that we do need help cleaning up this room. We're going to need help, getting everything in order. And before we go, we do have one more song to sing. So, if there's anything, is there anything else, Elizabeth? Is there any other announcements I need to make? Okay, but 8 a.m. sharp, we need everyone there to help set up, practice the opening ceremony, get everything in order. And I think, Noah, you said you know the tune, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so come up here because not everyone knows the tune. So if there's no more announcements, we can do one more song. I'm gonna have to. Yeah. All right. Yeah. We don't. Yeah, we can just. All right.
Sure.
All right. Shall we?
Sure.
All right. Whirlwinds of danger are raging around us. Overwhelming forces of darkness assail. Still in the fight, see advancing before us. Red flag of liberty that yet shall prevail. Then forward, ye workers, freedom awaits you. O'er all the world, on land and on sea. On with the fight for the cause of humanity. March, march, you toilers, and the world shall be free. Brothers and sisters in hunger are calling. Shall we be silent to their sorrow and woe? While in the fight, see our comrades are falling. Up then united and conquer the foe. Then forward, ye workers, freedom awaits you. Over the world, on land and on sea. On with the fight for the cause of humanity. March, march, you toilers, and the world shall be free. Off with the crowns of the tyrants of favor. Down in the dust will the princes appear. Strike off your chains, sons and daughters of labor. Wake all humanity, for victory is near. Then forward, ye workers, freedom awaits you. Over the world, on land and on sea. On with the fight for the cause of humanity. March, march, you toilers, and the world shall be free. Dare to struggle! Dare to win! 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 All right, see you all at 8 tomorrow. Doors open officially at 10. All right, let's do it. All right. All right.